You are listening to MCC Votes and Seats, the podcast series of the Center for Political Science of Mathias Corvinus Collegium. We provide election insights with experts and politicians. Ladies and gentlemen, this time we travel to the heart of the Balkans and dive into the depths of Kosovan politics to discuss the background, the circumstances, and the main conclusions of the February 2025 legislative election. It gives me great pleasure welcoming Mr. Mehdi Sejdiu, a political scientist from Kosovo. Hey Mehdi, how are you doing?
Fine, thank you. How are you?
Amazing. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation. Dear listeners, before we start, please do not forget to like and subscribe to our channel. If you find this series interesting, don't hesitate to check out our previous episodes as well. Dear Mehdi, would you mind telling us something about yourself?
Currently, I'm a PhD candidate in political science at the Heidelberg University here in Germany. Before that, my life was shaped by politics. So I was born as a refugee in Sweden at that time, but then my family didn't stay long because in the beginning of the 90s, they were sent back to Kosovo at that time because it was still deemed to be safe, ironically. So then my families became refugees again just before the Kosovo War, and I was in Germany. And after learning German and being in a German school, the war ended and we were sent back to Kosovo. So this childhood of just politics shaping my life and my family and all this moving made me very interested in politics. And as I grew up, as I became a teenager, my country declared independence. We found out about our new flag and a new hymn without a text. And I was experiencing as a citizen the state making these new institutions and everything, and that made me very interested in the process. So I studied it in my bachelor's in Istanbul. I continued in my master's in Heidelberg, and I also worked in the German Bundestag, but also for the Kosovo government on EU integration for 2 years, and in some civil society organizations and think tanks in Germany and Kosovo. Now I'm doing my PhD in Heidelberg. So I've been involved with politics, either through politics or think tanks or even academia to different layers, let's say, in politics, making politics or understanding politics.
Your story is fantastic, very fascinating. We wish you all success for your current and future endeavors, Mehdi.
Thank you.
So let's get into it. The parliamentary election results indicated that no party secured a majority in the 120-member assembly, although Prime Minister Albin Kurti's ruling party garnered the most votes. This party is called Vetëvendosje, which means self-determination, and it is portrayed as a left-wing populist social democratic, also soft nationalistic pro-EU political formation that was formed out of a pro-independence movement back in 2005. Kurti's party formed a coalition with minority parties in 2021 to establish a government, making the first time since Kosovo's independence that a government completed a full 4-year term. First things first, what was the key to success of Kurti's party and its governing partners? How come they managed to maintain their popularity?
It's not necessarily about popularity as much as it is about having a coalition that has a stability in the parliament. The fact that the coalition had, because even though it was a single majority government, it is a coalition because it had minorities in it, and it has some seats of Pudzo and Alternativa, which you mentioned, that were together in the bigger coalition. They ran together in the elections. It's not that they made the coalition after the election. But the key to this government stability was not necessarily the popularity, because that doesn't make you stable in and of itself, but the fact that they just had enough numbers to pass laws until the end of the mandate, and could pass laws until December was the last time, because the elections were in February, that they managed to pass laws. And actually the parliament was the first time since the Declaration of Independence that a legislature had passed so many laws in a mandate. And it was just because it had the stability of the numbers. Of course, there were some changes during the mandate. There were some MPs moving outside of the party, or changing parties, but because it had enough seats, that didn't damage necessarily the majority that it had. So it was a consolidated coalition with the bigger party, Vetëvendosje, but also Gudzon, Alternativa, and the minorities being loyal to the party. So I think the key was the internal cohesion of the coalition in and of itself, to not come outside of the ruling coalition in 4 years and stay together. And the fact that they ran together also in the subsequent elections means that they worked together or collaborated, or think that they collaborated well together during those 4 years.
I understand that. Talking about collaboration, international observers found that the 2025 election was peaceful and competitive, yet they criticized the presence of harsh rhetoric reflecting deep political divisions. Mehdi, would you elaborate on that for us a bit?
The discourse has been very much us and them. This was also for Vetëvendosje in 2021, given that it had this anti-establishment character of trying to bring a change to the ruling. There was always this idea that comes up in their discourse of the 20 years of having the same parties ruling, and needing a change was needed in their vision of how they portrayed the campaign. But it was interesting that this time there was no rhetoric against other political parties, but against some corporations and some business corporations and some media corporations. And it was interesting to see that Kurti, in his rhetoric, didn't talk as much about the opposition. I think because he also felt the opposition was not strong enough to portray them as he did before with this anti-establishment rhetoric of the party. But this time he dealt a lot with some media corporations and some business corporations. If you are in Kosovo and put on the TV stations, it's very likely you're going to have, especially the private media, not the public ones, the private media accusing all the time the government of doing something. So there's this media fight going on between the government and some media corporations, and this was portrayed a lot in the election campaign as well as some bigger corporations that tended, according to Vetëvendosje's view, benefit a lot from other governments in terms of public tenders and stuff like that. There was also rhetoric against those that had benefited from public funds in the past. So I think his main fight in these elections was actually not with opposition parties as much as it was with some private corporations and some media corporations that were against him.
I see. Now you're talking. Finally, we got to the juicy stuff of tactics and pressurizing and political games. What were the main campaign themes, campaign topics of the governmental parties and Prime Minister Kurti, and how did their slogans resonate with the electorate?
It was hard to ignore that a lot of the messaging from Vetëvendosje was around the idea of the sovereignty that they had gained with the dismantling of parallel institutions in the northern part of Kosovo, which are mainly Serb inhabited. For those that do not know, even though Kosovo has gotten its independence, declared its independence in 2008, it still had parallel institutions inside of its country running with Serbian laws, Serbian funds, and stuff like that. So especially those were predominant in the northern area of the country. This means that citizens of Kosovo residing in the north would have a parallel municipality. They still do have parallel schools and parallel hospitals. Parallel means that they are not funded by Kosovo institutions. Their doctors are not licensed by Kosovo institutions or schools, the curricula as well. And this happened also with license plates, with driver licenses, with a welfare system, and municipalities. So there was a municipality building which runs with a parallel institution, and a municipality building which runs with the Kosovo institutions. So what happened during these last 4 years was a lot of dismantling of these parallel institutions. It was the first time because even elections were held in Kosovo as if they're being held in Serbia. Only in Kosovo it was with the support of the OSCE that would gather the votes and then send them to Serbia. And it was in this mandate for the first time that a referendum on Kosovar soil was not allowed, a Serbian referendum on Kosovar soil, and also not elections on Kosovar soil. It's not the idea that they were against elections or against Kosovar Serbs with dual citizenship to vote in those, but the idea was that they should not be organized as if it's in Serbia. If it's going to be organized, it's going to be through some agreement with Kosovo, which obviously Serbia does not agree on because they do not recognize the state. I don't think that it's the role of the Kosovo state to accommodate the non-recognition of Serbia, but that's another issue. Other things that happened in the northern of Kosovo were a lot of dismantling of these parallel institutions, which also then came to a boycott of Kosovo Serbs from the judges, the police, the MPs in the parliament, also the heads of the municipalities. And then the Kosovo police went in, and we have this instability situation, 2 terrorist attacks. We can also talk about this later. But in the eyes of the domestic public, they see that the Kosovo flag is being raised there. They see that the illegal institutions are dismantled. Organized crimes are not ruling there anymore, and Kosovo citizens can go swim in the Ujman Lake, or Gazivoda Lake as it's known in Serbia. They can go in the northern part of Mitrovica and just have a coffee and chill out in the public square, which was not the case before. Before, Albanian citizens of Mitrovica were afraid to cross the bridge and go on the other side because there were some groups without uniforms, but they played the role of the parallel police that harassed them and didn't let them move freely in that area. So for a lot of Kosovo people, this was probably one of the strongest legacy of Vetëvendosje. And their slogan saying "Cep me cep," which means corner to corner of the country, was sort of an allegory of also having a sovereignty in all sides of the corner. Another big point of Vetëvendosje was the social welfare system. They brought for the first time child benefits and benefits for maternity leave for mothers, and also some programs that targeted unemployment youth and things like that. As for PDK and LDK, they had programs mostly on economy and some big infrastructural projects that they were promising, basically. But I didn't see a clash of political parties on programs per se. What the opposition parties really criticized Kurti on is the idea that because of the situation of instability that happened in the north, the EU has put measures on the Kosovo government, and they kept criticizing him that the fact that we have EU measures imposed and we don't have a good relationship with our Western partners as we used to have because of how we dealt with the dismantling of parallel structures in the north. Because obviously dismantling parallel structures caused instability, it caused protests, it caused also, we had also 2 terrorist attacks, one from a paramilitary group, one on critical infrastructure. And all of this tension was often related to the dismantling of the structures, but which for the Kosovo people was often seen as necessary because what they cared more was about having a functional state rather than just going on with this limited sovereignty, even if it comes to a cost of some measures.
Oh, I understand. That bridge you just mentioned is a very symbolic piece of infrastructure in Mitrovica, indeed. And talking about bridges, how would you describe the rhetoric of the opposition parties? And talking about opposition, which political formations were the main opponents of Prime Minister Albin Kurti's Vetëvendosje?
The issue with the 2 main opposition parties is that they had a new leadership, both of them, for the first time running in elections. PDK used to be the strongest party until, I think, the last elections. They were winning was 2011, but then they were either had presidents or were in formation of governments in grander coalitions until basically, I think 2019 was the last time they were in government. And Hamza, which was the prime minister candidate from PDK, was a popular finance minister, also the mayor of Mitrovica, south of Mitrovica, the municipality. He was popular among his own electorate, but he didn't manage to challenge Prime Minister Kurti. He also didn't manage to gain a lot of votes or win any significant city in Kosovo. He just managed to win, I think, three cities that his party wins usually, so it's nothing new. But he did increase the percentage-wise. I think 5%, if I'm not mistaken, was an increase of PDK. LDK similarly was running for the first time with the new leader. I think the new leader is promising for LDK, but it was just the first election, and he didn't, even though he tried to reform the party, he increased the percentages from 13 to 17, could be maybe by the end of the voting count could go around 17 or 18. It was still an increase like PDK, but not a very significant increase. I feel like they just are coming from a very low point, both of them, the parties, because in the last elections they had suffered a lot of losses, and in those 4 years they didn't really manage to have an effective opposition, but they did reform, did increase votes, but it was just at 5% and not enough to really challenge Vetëvendosje. If you look at the vote count right now as it stands, Vetëvendosje has almost 41%, but PDK has around 22, 21, and LDK 17. So both of them, the second and the third party, do not have more votes than the first party. So there's still a huge gap between them, but I think it's positive that both of them managed to increase their votes, but it wasn't enough to really challenge the winner of the elections.
So the biggest opposition player, the Democratic Party of
Yes.
Kosovo, is often portrayed as a unionist party that aims at achieving a unification, a kind of unification between Kosovo and Albania. Is the creation of a Greater Albania an irredentist concept that is used to earn the sympathy of right-wing voters, or is it something that is widely accepted and desired by the society in Kosovo?
So it's not PDK that wants it. It's actually Vetëvendosje that had it in its program, Union of Albania. PDK
Okay.
and LDK not so much. So if you ask Albanians, it's pretty much, I think people in Hungary would understand it very well because of how their country and how minorities live outside of the borders of the country. So if you would ask even Hungarians in Romania, would they rather like to live in a united, they would say yes, but they wouldn't take arms to fight it or try to gain it through violence. They still would respect the states they're in. So if you would ask Kosovo citizens, and polls do ask them sometimes whether they want a union with Albania, I think the majority of the people say yes. Similarly, in Albania, it is the same culture, it is the same language, it is, but the countries are two different countries that were created under two different historical circumstances. Vetëvendosje was the only Kosovo party that actually had it in its program with the union with Albania. Now it doesn't figure at the elections program anymore. But the idea that the party usually uses in the party gatherings an Albanian flag instead of a Kosovo one are these like symbolism that the country is an Albanian country, which kind of runs in contrary to the idea of the international community in portraying a very homogeneous country to like a multi-ethnic country, which it is constitutionally. Kosovo is constitutionally a multi-ethnic country, but in essence, it's still 92% Albanian. And that you can see that also reflecting in the program. I don't feel like there's an actual strong movement to unite both countries, but there is a push for both countries to work more together and have, for example, infrastructural projects that bring the community closer. There is a railway project that connects Kosovo with Albania. There are projects of energy that connect both, and there is a push for the country to work more culturally and have more economic exchange with each other. But I think that's where it stands right now. So I don't see any actual political unification of both countries. There were some ideas being floated around a few years ago with a partition or an exchange of territory with Serbia, and then the rest goes to Albania. But those were all behind closed doors being made at that time. So it's really hard to take them as something actual.
Okay, discussing certain historical circumstances, as you put it, the Serb list, the minority political party of ethnic Serbs living in Kosovo, collected roughly 4.6% of the votes, which provides them 10 parliamentary mandates. The party maintains strong connections to the Serbian government, to Serbian President Aleksandar Vučić, and the Serbian Progressive Party as well. While, 4 years ago, Kurti campaigned with the promise of continuing a dialogue with Belgrade. In September 2021, his government announced a ban on Serbian license plates being used by Serbian citizens in Kosovo as an alleged reaction to Serbia not recognizing Kosovan license plates, as you just mentioned a few minutes ago. This decision, however, triggered demonstrations in the northern part of Kosovo, where Serbs are the majority, urging the Serbian government to issue threats of military action. Further, the Kosovan government announced in July 2022 that Serbian citizens entering Kosovo would receive entry and exit documents, leading to local Serbs erecting barricades in Kosovo. And as a result, this led to Serbian politicians and policemen departing from Kosovan institutions. All in all, those unpleasant happenings do not paint a rosy picture about the Pristina-Belgrade dialogue, do they? I know Albin Kurti's voters want a decisive, straightforward, and let's say self-confident political position towards Serbia, a neighbor that won't recognize Kosovo as a country, nor the Kosovan people's right to self-determination. However, the ruling party, just like the majority of the Kosovan citizens, want Kosovo to join the European Union. Yet, as long as the Pristina-Belgrade relations remain tense, the youngest European state stays in the status of only a potential candidate. What solutions does the new Kurti government offer to end this situation?
So, in terms of solutions, I think no party, actually every party in these elections avoided to talk about the solution. And what happens usually before elections in Kosovo, they would just say things like, I will protect the interest of the country, and they wouldn't go into details because it's not a very popular thing, because solutions usually entail compromise. It's a very not a very popular thing to do in election campaigns in Kosovo to talk about compromise. So even all political parties did not really touch upon whether they would form an association of certain municipalities and things like that. But just to correct you, I think as it stands, nine seats will be winning the Serb list. One of them they lost to the party of forgot the name of the party. It's of Nenad Rashic, which was a minister in the government. I think as it stands, they will be losing one seat to him, which is the first time in a long time that they lost one seat. But it's also a symbol that their actually influence is waning. What's very interesting to see, the Serb majority municipalities, Vetëvendosje did very well in them, because even though we call them Serb majority municipalities, they usually are mixed as well. They have to 10 to 20% Albanian population in them, and Vetëvendosje usually came the second of the Serb list in those, which was a very interesting phenomenon. It's the first time this is happening. But in terms of all of this problems in the last years, which had to do a lot of with extending Pristina's sovereignty over its northern territory, you had the Serb citizens of Kosovo being caught in this clash between Pristina and Belgrade. And for example, it's very hard for them because they rely on social services or salaries from the parallel institutions of Serbia. And them to make decisions to abandon those, they usually do not make them unless they're being told so by Belgrade. For example, in the beginning, when the government announced the license plates to be converted, I come close to Ferizaj, and we have Štrpce, for example. And there in Štrpce, you never saw any Serb license plates for many years, because in south of the Iber River, every Kosovo Serb had already license plates, and those illegal license plates did not exist in that territory of Kosovo. They only existed in the northern municipalities. So this was not something that was politicized before, but this was politicized in the beginning of this crisis. So what happened when some citizens just didn't care about license plates, and they saw that the government put out the announcement that these are going to be illegal, you need to convert your license plates, and they did convert the license plates, only to find out in the next day that their car was bombed. And this happened while the car was in the front of their house. So a lot of these Serb citizens did not make decisions to not convert their license plates because they feel some loyalty to one party or the other, but because they were also threatened. They were threatened in one side by Kosovo institutions to telling them these are illegal and you should convert them. And then they were also dealing with criminal groups that were bombing their cars when they were switched. So I feel like they are being politicized and instrumentalized by this situation. They're caught up in this situation, and I feel the best actually, and this doesn't get told a lot, but if Serbia would have recognized Kosovo, the community could become a bridge between both countries instead of a wedge. Because now it's a wedge which both parties in the Kosovo side tries to integrate them forcefully into institutions, which they don't want, and the Serb side tries to keep them out of the institutions, and they become sort of a pawn in this fight between Kosovo and Serbia. But I think you have the same, for example, with Hungarians in Vojvodina, that they can become something which connects two communities together. Because as I feel it, and correct me if I'm wrong, but Hungarians in Serbia now, because of the good relationship between Serbia and Hungary, they sort of connect two communities and are not politicized as an ethnic minority that breaks up the two communities. And I feel this is not being talked enough, that an actual recognition of Kosovo by Serbia could turn minorities into communities that become a bridge and not a wedge. But I feel as long as Serbia is not going to recognize Kosovo, the non-recognition will come at a cost. And this cost is going to be usually mostly felt by its citizens in Kosovo, because they are being caught up. They are not necessarily an actor as much as they're being pushed by two sides. For example, we had many cases where Serb citizens wanted to take part in Kosovo institutions and they were not allowed to. We had, for example, one case where one football player wanted to play in the national team. The next day, both his parents, who were being paid also from parallel institutions, were fired from their jobs. We had many cases of Kosovo Serbs wanting to join the Kosovo army, wanting to join the Kosovo police, but they were being threatened and intimidated, and even being held for half a day in Serbia. When they passed to visit family in Serbia, they passed the border and they were being held and questioned for a long time. So it's not just Kosovo is trying to extend their sovereignty, but it's also the Serbian state not allowing them to integrate. And this brings them, I feel the Kosovo Serb community is in the most vulnerable position when the both countries are not agreeing on things. And it could actually be in the best position if both countries have a good relationship. I feel very bad for them being caught up in the situations. A lot of them are just normal citizens. For example, when the judges and prosecutors and policemen did boycott the institutions and resign, a lot of them had a lot of the Kosovar colleagues had actually very good words for a lot of them, just saying that they were very good colleagues and they were very good workers, but they had a command from Belgrade that they need to resign, so they did resign. So I just feel sad that in all of this political games, it's these normal citizens that get to pay the bill at the end of the day for these tensions. And even in the KFOR, these protests that were being, KFOR soldiers were being injured, and two of them were Hungarian with life-altering injuries. A lot of the protesters were actually people that came from Serbia into Kosovo and took part into these violent protests there. These protests were not against like these. It's just like very stupid to think why these protests happened right now in retrospect, because it happened because they boycotted an election, and when the mayor that won only 3% of the vote wanted to enter the building, the protests happened and Molotov cocktails were being thrown and these sort of things. So in all this political instability, it's sad to say, but it's the Serb minority in Kosovo that is being instrumentalized the most and being pushed around.
I knew that the picture was not simply black and white, and one has to zoom in to understand all the details, all the mosaics that make the Kosovo-Serbia relationship. However, if you take a look at the election map of Kosovo, we don't have a black and white picture either, because the biggest opposition party, the right-wing Democratic Party of Kosovo, finished at first place in the central region of Kosovo, while the rest of the country's constituencies were won by the governing Vetëvendosje party, with the exception, of course, of the regions with an ethnic Serbian majority. What factors explain the favorable positions of the biggest opposition party in the heart of the country?
That region is called also the Drenica region, known to be the birthplace of the KLA army, the Kosovo Liberation Army, which was active in 98 and 99 mainly. After the war, the elites of the KLA became the political elites of the country, and a lot of their constituencies are from regions or are from people that were in the KLA or had family members in the KLA. Drenica being the birthplace of the Kosovo Liberation Army, and also the place where a lot of its main figures, including former Prime Minister and President Hashim Thaci, come from, is still votes because of partisanship, the Kosovo Liberation Army. So this is the reason why usually they win. They just not just win, but win like maybe sometimes 60, 70% of the vote. It's mostly partisanship that came throughout after the independence. But this does not happen in other regions of the country. The war KLA was also active in other regions of the country, but mostly only in these very hard cells that they still keep on winning, but they do not win in other regions of the country. In other regions, people do not vote as much for partisanship as they do vote for the candidate or for the best political offer at that time. But this does not, in Drenica, they still do have this partisanship and this sort of identity with the Kosovo Liberation Army and PDK that came out of the Kosovo Liberation Army.
I suspected there had to be something like this behind these results. It is very interesting how history, how family ties, how cultural heritage and sociology meet. And also, do we know anything sure about the voting preferences of the different layers of the Kosovan society?
Women usually tend to vote more for Vetëvendosje. You can see it also, we have a quota that every third candidate should be a woman. For example, if you have 9 candidates, 3 of them will be a woman, even if they didn't get more votes than the 7th man on the list. And Vetëvendosje is the only party that does not need the quota because women get enough votes for themselves. So the LDK and PDK and AAK still need this quota in order to have women as MPs. Our LDK and PDK are also progressing. They have this elections more women that have gained a seat on their own without the quota, but still they did need a few seats with the quota. And this tells me that a lot of the women do vote for Vetëvendosje. Vetëvendosje is also very popular with the youth, whereas our AAK in English and PDK is very popular with KLA affiliated people, as I said before. And in the others, we don't really have data to show. The youth and the women vote a lot for Vetëvendosje, but everything else is pretty spread out. I wouldn't say there's actually cities voting for. In previous elections, that was the case, a rural-urban divide, but I don't see the rural-urban divide much in this. It usually ends up being different only for a few percent, but not 10% or something like that.
I
But
understand.
Vetëvendosje remains popular with the youth and women a lot.
Okay, sorry for the interruption.
Yeah.
Just to conclude our most memorable conversation, Mehdi, personally, what did you find the most interesting about the 2025 parliamentary election in Kosovo?
What is important to mention, we didn't mention yet, is that we have a hung parliament. Vetëvendosje currently has, as it stands, has 47 seats, and it will have 11 minority seats, 1 from the non-Serb list and 10 from the other 9 minorities, from the other non-minorities, and it needs 61. So as it stands now, it needs 4 more seats at least to form a minimum winning coalition. And everyone is looking at the diaspora votes, which are going to be counted in the next week. And those might add a few seats to Vetëvendosje. If I'm not mistaken, last time they added 2 seats. So it could be that the party is going to run short of 2 or 1 seat or maximum 3 in order to form a minimum winning coalition. So there's going to be a lot of talking with MPs from other parties. There are some smaller parties that entered the parliament through a pre-election coalition with other parties, and these do not have loyalty to that bigger party they entered the coalition in, and so they can separate from their parliamentary group and form a winning coalition with Vetëvendosje. So I feel like this is going to be at the end what is to be seen. There's also interesting to mention is that the year after there's going to be the president elected. This president might get an extension of a mandate, another president might get elected, but for that 80 votes are needed, 2/3 of the parliament. So there's going to be also some discussions on who's going to be the next president of Kosovo next year. And this remains to be seen in the days to come, what sort of bargaining will happen between parties. Will they be able to form a coalition? If Vetëvendosje fails to garner a majority, then the second and third party are also allowed to try to form a majority, which is, I think it's going to be unlikely, but it's a constitutional right they have if Vetëvendosje fails to form a governing coalition, a governing majority. So these are things that are going to be seen. Another thing we didn't mention, but it's interesting to mention, is that the new US administration is going to have an impact on the last time they had an envoy, which was very active in the domestic politics, also pretty much the ideator of overthrowing the Kurti I government. And he's been very active on social media, attacking the prime minister during the election. So I'm not sure what's going to be his role in the new administration. He's an envoy for special missions. If he's going to be dealing with Kosovo, we do not know. But if he is, we're having we're going to have very unusual things and a lot of surprises. Some might be negative, some positive for the region in the future. But what is happening now with Ukraine and Gaza in the terms of that they do not expect what's coming next, what sort of idea is being floated around for their conflict, might also happen to the Serbia and Kosovo conflict. So we just don't know. It's and this will play. We do not hear about it now because the US is pretty much busy with Gaza and Ukraine at this point. Serbia has student protests that are very active, and Kosovo still doesn't have a government. But I think by summer or by autumn, we're going to start hearing also maybe some bizarre claims and statements on how to solve the conflict. Let's just see what's going to happen.
Then I guess it's best keeping an eye on Kosovan political happenings in the months to come. Mehdi Sejdiu, we are grateful for your most appreciated insights into Kosovan politics. Thanks to your very useful viewpoints, now we are able to see the bigger picture about the party system, the social, economic, political cleavages, and the future of the newest European state. Thank you for your great contribution.
Thank you for the opportunity to be here.
Dear listeners, you've been following the newest episode of Votes and Seats about the February 2025 legislative election in Kosovo. My name is Balin Tertot. I thank you very much for your kind attention. Please find our previous analysis on past elections in Europe and stay tuned for our upcoming releases. Take care. Goodbye.